Paris plus degree. The year is 1757. A crowd of more than 10,000 people is gathered. The largest public execution in decades, grandstands have been constructed. Windows in surrounding buildings have been rented for exorbitant prices. Entire families have come. They brought food as if it were a festival because they are not here to witness a quick hanging or even a relatively merciful decapitation. They are here to see Robert Francois Damien, the man who attempted to assassinate the king, undergo a punishment that has not been applied for generations. An execution so extreme that when the details were explained to the assistant executioners, 3 of them resigned immediately. They said they would rather lose their jobs than participate. And when Damien's is brought to the platform, the process that is about to begin will last more than 4 hours. For hours of calculated agony of methods designed to maximize suffering before allowing death. And in the end, even the crowd accustomed to public violence will be sickened. Some fainting, others vomiting because there is a limit to what humans can bear to witness. And the execution of Damien's will spectacularly exceed that limit. Today you will discover the true story of the last execution by dismemberment in France. Not the sanitized version from history books that briefly mentions severe punishment, but the reality documented in eyewitness accounts, including Giacomo Casanova, who was present and recorded every horrified detail. How Damien's, a disturbed man who slightly wounded the king with a small knife, was transformed into an example that the state wanted to use to demonstrate what happened to Jesuits, and how the brutality of the execution ended up having the opposite effect. Instead of terrorizing the population into obedience, it caused revulsion that accelerated reforms and eventually abolished such methods. The story begins on the 5th day of January in the year 1757. Robert Francois Damien, 42-year-old man, former soldier and domestic servant, approached King Louis X 15th at Versailles. The king was entering his carriage. Damien had a knife, a small one, a penknife really, and he stabbed the king once in the side between the ribs. The wound was superficial. The king wore multiple layers of clothing because of the winter cold. The knife penetrated only a few centimeters. It bled, but not severely. The king recovered completely within weeks. But the crime was not measured by physical damage. It was an attempt to assassinate a monarch anointed by God. The crime of lèse majesté, the most serious possible. And the punishment had been codified in law since the 14th century. Execution by dismemberment. Damien's was captured immediately, taken to prison, tortured for weeks to extract a confession and the names of co-conspirators. He insisted he acted alone, that he was mentally disturbed. That voices told him to attack the king because the church and parliament were in conflict and the king was not resolving it. It made no sense. He was clearly unstable, but the authorities wanted a conspiracy, so the torture continued. Spanish boots crushed his legs. Water was forced down his throat until his abdomen distended, but he had no names to give because there was no conspiracy. The trial was a formality. Conviction was guaranteed. On the 26th day of March in the year 1757, the sentence was read, and when Damien's heard the details, he collapsed. He begged for mercy, but there was none. The sentence was specific, explicit, and it would follow the royal ordinance of 1348 regarding the punishment of risides. On the morning of the 28th of March, Damien's was taken to Plastigrove. The crowd was already waiting. A platform had been erected, and the instruments were arranged. Pincers, cauldrons of molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, and liquid sulfur for horses, and a wheel to break bones if necessary. The chief executioner was Charles Henry Sanson, from a family that would execute in Paris for generations. But even he was visibly disturbed. The first phase was public torture before death. Damien's was stripped to the waist, tied to a post on the platform, and pincers heated until red hot were used to tear his flesh. His chest first, arms, thighs, pieces of muscle were ripped away. As Damien screamed, the executors poured a mixture of molten lead, boiling oil, resin, and sulfur into the open wounds. The objective was to cause maximum pain while partially cauterizing to prevent death by bleeding. They wanted him conscious for the next phase. Casanova, watching from a rented window, wrote that Damien's screams were inhuman, that the crowd initially shouted insults, but gradually fell silent because it was becoming too much. Some began to leave, others could not look away, and Damien's, after 20 minutes of torture with hot metal and boiling liquids, was still conscious, still screaming. The second phase was dismemberment. The method used was drawing. Ropes were tied to each limb, arms, and legs. 4 horses were positioned, 1 for each rope, and at the signal, the horses were whipped. They pulled, the tension increased. Damien's bones cracked. Joints began to dislocate, but the limbs did not separate. The horses pulled for more than half an hour. Damien screamed continuously. But the human body is surprisingly resilient. The executives added 2 horses, 6 in total. Now they pulled again for another 45 minutes, and still the limbs remained attached. The crowd was growing restless. Nausea, horror. Some called for them to finish it, to kill Damien's mercifully. But the law required dismemberment, so the executioner made a decision. He ordered the surgeon present to cut the tendons and muscles at the joints with aknath. The surgeon, a man named Lion, initially refused. He said he was a doctor, not a torturer, but he was ordered under penalty of imprisonment. So he climbed onto the platform, avoided looking at Damien's face, and cut the tendons of the elbows, of the knees, and when the horses pulled again, the limbs finally began to separate. First the right arm, then the left leg, then the other 2, and Damien's was still alive. Witnesses report that after 3 limbs were torn off, he still spoke. The words were not coherent, but he was conscious. Only when the 4th limb was removed, approximately 3 hours and 45 minutes after the beginning, did he finally lose consciousness. But his heart continued beating for another 15 minutes. While the dismembered torso bled on the platform, the final phase was destruction of the body. Damien's remains were collected, placed on a pea, and burned. The ashes were scattered. All his properties were confiscated. The house where he was born was demolished, and his family was exiled. The name Damien's was forbidden. It was an attempt to erase his existence completely. But the public reaction was unexpected. Instead of intimidating the population, the execution caused widespread revulsion. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire wrote condemnations. They argued that the brutality of the state was worse than Damien's crime, that a civilized society could not justify such methods, and the seeds of change were planted. 3 decades later, during the French Revolution, such executions were abolished. Ironical, a rapalode by the guillotine, invented to be merciful, instant death, no prolonged torture. And although the guillotine had its own horrors, especially during the Terror, it was a recognition that the old methods were unacceptable. But why did 3 assistant executioners refuse to participate? Records show that professional executioners had a code. They did the work because someone had to do it. But there were limits. Executions should be efficient, relatively quick. Prolonging agony unnecessarily was seen as excessive cruelty, even by their standards, and the dismemberment of Damien's crossed the line, especially because everyone knew that the injury to the king was not serious. The punishment was disproportionate, and this troubled even men whose job was to kill. The executioners who refused were Jean Martin, Pierre Duchamp, and Francis Leblanc. They lost their positions, but they found other work. And decades later, when the guillotine was adopted, descendants of Martin returned to the profession, because the changed method was something they could execute without moral remorse. Was Damien's a villain or a victim? He committed a crime. He attacked the king. But he was clearly mentally disturbed. In the modern era, he would be hospitalized, not executed. And the punishment he received was so extreme that it transformed him from a criminal into a martyr in the eyes of many. Voltaire wrote that the barbarity of the punishment exceeded the barbarity of the crime 1,000 times. The story of Damien's is a reminder of multiple truths that states use extreme violence to maintain power, that public brutality can have the opposite effect to that intended, and that progress in human rights is not abstract. It is measured in specific practices that society decides not to tolerate anymore. Dismemberment was one, which burning was another, slavery was a third. And each abolition was fought against those who argued that the old methods were necessary, that change would lead to chaos. But change came, not always quickly, not always completely. But the execution of Damiens was a turning point. The last time that France applied complete medieval punishment and the horror. It generated accelerated reforms that would eventually transform the entire judicial system. Not immediately. The revolution was 3 decades away, but the seeds were planted on that day at Place de Grève, when even the crowd, accustomed to public violence, decided that there was a limit. 10,000 people came expecting a spectacle. Perhaps 3,000 remained until the end. The rest left, not necessarily out of pity, but because they could no longer watch. And this inability, this fundamental human limit to witness suffering, was more powerful than any law. Because when a society collectively decides that something is unbearable to watch, it eventually decides that it is unbearable to do. Damiens died in the most horrible way imaginable under French law, but his death was not in vain. Not because he was a hero. He was not. He was a confused man who committed a violent act. But because the brutality of the punishment revealed something about the society that administered it, that a state willing to torture for 4 hours was morally bankrupt. And the recognition of this slow and gradual lead to changes that benefited countless future condemned prisoners who at least died quickly. And that in the context of execution, history counts as progress. Grim, minimal, but progress nonetheless.